Welcome to the HR Chat Show, one of the world's most downloaded and shared podcasts designed for HR pros, talent execs, tech enthusiasts, and business leaders. For hundreds more episodes and what's new in the world of work, subscribe to the show, follow us on social media, and visit hrgazette.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the HR Chat Show. A very special episode, listeners, because here I am at CPL in their cool studio with the amazing Barry Winkless, head of Future of Work Institute at CPL, host of the Future Work World podcast. And actually, straight after doing this pod, we're gonna record one for your show. And he's also the author of the newly released book, Future Work World. Barry has spent more than 25 years working at the intersection of strategy, innovation, and organizational change. Over the past 7 years, he's helped shape the strategic direction of CPL, one of Europe's largest talent and workforce organizations, while also building its Future of Work Institute, a thought leadership hub, innovation playground, and advisory team working with organizations across sectors and geographies. It's a pretty cool company, listeners. I've got lots more to say about Barry, but actually I'm just going to stop there and say, Barry, how are you doing? Thank you very much for joining me on this special episode of the HR Chat Show.
Thanks very much, Bill. Great to be here in my own studio.
So we're recording this episode today, the morning after the night before. Last night we had a relaunch of Disrupt HR.
That's right.
in Dublin, and you kindly came along to that, and you brought a bunch of copies of your new book, which has been very well received.
Yes, so far.
And I've had a chance to read through some of it. On page 8, I'm not saying that's
Ouch.
as far as I got to.
We're going straight into that.
We're going to go straight into your book, I think. We're going to go straight into your book. On page 8.
So can I remember the book now?
Well, here we go. We're going to test you. You talk about something you talk about all the time, which is the 3 Ws.
Yeah.
And I think that is going to shape a lot of the answers that you're going to give me today. So
Yeah.
I'd like to start there.
Yeah.
But for our listeners, can you explain what those 3 Ws are and why they matter so much?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I'll go one step backwards first because it's a good way of answering it. And I think what's really important that all your listeners should know is that I'm actually not from a HR background. I'm from a strategic and innovation background, right? So a lot of my work was around developing strategies and creating new products, new processes, new systems, new innovations, whatever you want to call it that. And it's really that drove my understanding for the need of a framework for HR professionals around the future of work, right? And what's really interesting for me, and this goes back 4 years in our work on the Future Work Institute, was that there really was lacking a framework. So I'm sure you came across this yourself, Bill. There wasn't really definitions of what the future of work was, or what it could be, or anything like that. Lots of different perspectives. And for some people, it was around flexible working, for others, around AI and all this kind of stuff. So for wearing my strategic hat, I said, well, hold on a second, we actually need a framework here, right? So in the book, actually, there's 4 sections, all right? The first section is around the mindset. The second bit is around really the meta waves, these big changes happening. The third is around a model to use. And the fourth piece is move. So it's almost like a strategic guide for the future of work. And the reason I'm saying all of that long intro is because that first section around the mindset is, how do we actually think strategically around the now and next of work so that we're one step ahead of whatever competition we might have, or, ahead in terms of fulfillment, whatever way we want to measure that. And within that, I tried to come up with this really, really simple model, which was the 3W model, right? Which is basically, workplace. So that's where work takes place from a digital, physical or virtual space. Workforce, so that's the skills, the organizational structures around the workforce. And then finally, Worktasks, which is around the mindsets, the tools, the technologies to deliver the actual work. And it's absolutely core to, everything else then beyond the book. And, it sounds deceptively easy, right? But to come to that simple definition around the future work took a long time. So if I bring it all together, really the definition of the future work as it relates to organizations is the purposeful design of the 3 Ws, right, in the business of, in the context of business and society, right? So that's the official definition. It took me a long time to get to that level of simplicity.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the HR Chat Podcast. If you enjoy the audio content we produce, you'll love our articles on the HR Gazette. Learn more at hrgazette.com. And now, back to the show.
Okay, love it. Thank you very much. Your new book argues that organizations must become destinations for talent. What does that really mean, Barry? And why is this idea pretty critical right now?
Yeah, I think I purposely used that phrase destinations, right? Because I always had this, I have a big thing in my toolkit. I said that innovation really happens bringing knowledge from other places into, areas that weren't used to that kind of knowledge base, right? So some of that thinking comes from the travel and tourism industry, right? So who are really good at designing and talking about destinations, right? I would say we're not very good at that within organizations, right? So the idea of destination is thinking about everything, every small detail, and designing it purposely, right? So thinking like a designer, thinking like a destination designer, so recognizing that your place of work is a destination that some people want to have a long haul in, some will like a short haul, some will come to it in different ways, right? And it's really, really important for me because if you think about often when we talk about HR challenges and, keeping people in organizations, it's actually bad design, really. So even thinking like that changes everything, to be honest about it. And it's actually one of the 3 mindsets I talk about in the book is how can HR professionals think more like designers, right? And through that process, improve, re-energize, reimagine some of those initiatives that didn't quite get there, right? We've all had those. I'm sure everybody out there has had those types of initiatives. And it's really, really important, particularly today, because I think, in this new age of AI, technological change, people and the key people that are driving our business are absolutely more important, right? Those core people within our business that ultimately helps to drive the growth of that business. We really need to design, our organizations in the best possible way to get the best out of those people.
So part of your answer there, did you say that it's not so much about having a strategy to keep your people around for the long term, and so it's more about how you treat your people? Did I hear that?
Yeah,
correctly?
it's more designing how you treat your people, right? And what I mean by that is, if I think about some of the work we've done, and you take this idea of a value proposition, right?
Yep.
People talk about employee value propositions, but really they're not thinking about it as a value proposition. What I mean by that is thinking about a value proposition as something you're trying to sell. Right, that's a big difference to thinking about a value proposition that we improve slightly, right? So even within our work, we've identified 20 core areas that will keep people within an organization, right? Very, very simply. And oftentimes, and just to give you a sense of what I mean by this idea of designing, oftentimes the leadership team will have a totally different perspective on the 5 or 6 elements of that proposition that are actually important to people and that keep them in an organization versus the actual people that are in that organization, right?
Yeah, sure.
So there's your gap between, leadership and core team. And that's an example of poor design, right? Yeah. And it's also an example of even just the power of thinking in a design way and to understand more deeply those individuals, right? And to go much deeper in terms of their drives, their motivations, etc. And then linking those 2 things together is really, really powerful. And I think it's one thing to have a value proposition, it's another thing to have a purposely designed one, right? So I think, when I talk about strategy, it's really around this design-led idea, right? And making sure that design is obviously relevant for people, but it's also feature focused as well. And it's one of the reasons, I suppose in the book, I talk about 3 mindsets. So I talk about this idea of the destination designer, the societal whisperer, and then the systems architect. So it kind of covers I call it the pyramid, right? I talked about the pyramid. I had 1 minute to present my book at the Disrupt HR event last night. And, I do talk about those 3 things because they work together to create organizations that are once more human-centered, technology-enabled, but societal focused, right? So that's, if you have those 3 mindsets, you get to those 3 parts of what a real future fit organization looks like. So I'm not going to say the book solves all the problems of the world, but it's definitely a toolkit for thinking very clearly, and I always use the Wizard of Oz analogy where, Dorothy has just landed in Oz and she opens the door into this Technicolor world. Yeah. And that's really what this book tries to do. It's to give you a Technicolor 360 perspective on the now and next of work, and hopefully I've succeeded in that. It sounds like when I say it out loud, it sounds like a big thing to try to do. But if I'm partially get there, I've done okay,
I love that. I love that. And listeners, just for clarity there, I'm not a mean man. I gave Barry 2 minutes. Okay. And what are 2 minutes it was, by the way? We're doing like high fives. And Barry had like everybody up, all the crowd were up and they were doing the high fives, and it was a lot of fun. And my copy of the book says, to my very, very, very best friend.
That's true. Yeah. Well, you did tell me to say that.
I did tell you to say that. Okay, so you paint a very honest picture of the current reality of work. From what you're seeing, what are leaders most in denial about when it comes to how work has already changed?
That's a really, really good question. I'm really interested in I talk about this flexi form of working as one of the big metaways in the book. And I'm really interested in the gap between leadership's approach to flexible working and, people at work's approach to flexible working. So in Ireland and actually in the UK as well, we're seeing, people are talking about this rollback. It's not quite like that. It's more like a more formalized approach to flexible working, right? Yeah. And much more of a clearly understood way of working, right, in organizations. But I think what's important that leaders really need to understand, and again, I've come back to that designer mindset, what they've actually done there is they're taking a performance criteria, right, if I'm wearing my designer's mindset, and they're making it less optimal for their people, right? So what often will happen in that instance is somebody will change one of those parameters like flexible working. So they might, for example, move from 3 days, working from home to 2 days working from home. Now, the reality is it will take probably 12 months for that impact of that performance indicator as a dissatisfier to really head home, right? And you're going to see a lot of that, I think, over the next year or two as organizations have said, well, we need people here, blah, blah, blah. So that's a big one for me. This idea of presence versus performance, right, is a big one. And I think it's a great example of not thinking about these things as a performance, factor, right, and not thinking like a designer. So that's a big one for me. I think the second thing for me then obviously is properly getting heads around this human machine way of working, right? That's a big one. And if I think about most of the organizations we were working with, you're into that, I'm going to say, pilot stroke early integration phase of this kind of way of working. But the reality is a lot of people are using AI at this moment in time. I'm really interested around the gap between thinking about human capability and skills development and what I would call human expansion. So that multiplication of human and machine to actually expand people's minds, not to basically decrease their cognitive function. So a lot of the research we're seeing out there at the moment really highlights if we're using things like AI in our own way over a long period of time, it actually has a cognitive declination function on our brains, right? So I don't know if you know this, but there's a lot of research out there, even it was done probably in 2020, 21, 22. The more we use simple things, right, like GPS in your car, you're actually having a net detrimental effect on your spatial reasoning, right? Yep. Now that sounds really scary when you start thinking about it, and then you multiply that by other autonomous tools. So I think a big gap for me is putting the right frameworks in place to use that machine-human interface in the right way that expands human beings, right? I wrote an article recently actually around the 12 design principles for the human machine age. And it was really interesting because when I started looking around, there wasn't really much there to kind of pull from, right? So, some would say I pulled it out of my own proverbial to get it out there. So I think that's a really, really big one for me on that side. I think the third one for me then is really this idea of moving away from initiatives and into this broader concept of a strategic way of working, because if you think even about, people listening there from a HR perspective being hit by a lot, they're being hit by D&I, skills-based organizations, AI, technology, blah, blah, blah. And a better way to think about it, so if I'm wearing my systems architect mindset, is to think about that work has actually jumped onto a new S-curve, jumped onto a new level of performance. And it's almost like we need to recreate the dictionary, for the world of work. And we need to reintegrate all these things into the way of doing things, right? Yeah. So, for example, if we're talking about leadership, instead of talking about, neurodiversity, inclusive practice, blah, blah, what is the new leadership look like? And what are the elements that make that up? And that becomes our way of leadership, as opposed to here's a load of initiatives that together make up leadership, right? It's a very different way of thinking about things. And I think that's a challenge for me. Is the third challenge is that idea of integrating all of these things into a new way of doing things.
And leadership is potentially in crisis in a few years' time because young people are not being hired. Entry-level people are not going to the workforce anymore. They're being replaced by AI functions in many instances. 30% of middle management roles right now could be replaced by organizations if they choose to do them, but many are trying to upskill or reskill. So one big crisis for leadership is who's going to replace the guys who are there at the moment? What do we do about that?
These are big questions. Yeah, I think I'm going to start by talking about ideality. It's one of the big trends I talk about in the book. And again, I'm coming back to my systems mindset, systems architect mindset. So if you think about it, I was involved in a number of projects in this over the years. If you think about the evolution of technology, it's ultimately going to this concept of ideality, which really means things doing things by themselves, right, at zero cost and available all of the time, right? So if you think about AI, all of these various technologies, they're bringing us into this technological ideality, right, if we want to call it that. My big concern actually is our conscious approach to leadership isn't evolving at the same pace as this move towards ideality. So that's a big concern. I think when we talk about leadership, I think we have to talk about it more as a competency these days and think about it as leadership being more democratized across multiple individuals as opposed to centralized on core people, right? Yeah. So what's really interesting to me is even in this age of big impacts around AI, we are also getting this massive increase in the creation of cooperatives and collective type organizations, right? Organizations where everybody technically is a leader within that organization, and where everybody has an ownership of that organization. So I think there's a couple of big things that leaders need to think about. One is, stop thinking about leaders as people and thinking about it as a competency shared by multiple people. Because if you even look at the younger generations, it's not that they don't want to lead, because a lot of people from the research make those conclusions. I don't believe that's true. I think what they have is a different perspective on leadership is. So in other words, they're happy to lead at certain points and on certain projects and on certain types of work, right? So that is also really, really important. For me, all of this comes back to what type of organizations are we trying to build? And it's really interesting because I love music, and anytime I do a talk, I always bring out these two bands, right? Radiohead, I'm sure you know well. Bill, just have a funny feeling you like Radiohead, but there you go. Versus this band called Velvet Sundown, which is a really bad name, but it's a fully AI generated business, right? And I always play two pieces of music from both bands, and I ask everybody, look, what do you prefer? Like, what do you actually like here? And everybody without fail says, like, Radiohead, that music is, I played the Kid A album, right? And they go, wow, that's, and I said, the reality is that album is this perfect blend of human and machine, creating new types of artwork that wouldn't have existed before, versus, this autonomous, droning, crappy band, right? That might sound okay for a quick listen in the bathroom in the morning, but not for anything else. And for me, it's the same thing when it comes to organizations. I think we have to start making conscious decisions around the type of companies that we want to create. And if we get this human-machine interface right, I think it should be less around talking about replacement or even reshapement and talking about expansion of humans, right? Mm-hmm. And I think I have just a funny feeling, right, from some of my research is that that's actually the path of real competitive differentiation. Because if everybody's using the same tools in AI and they're all using the same approaches, it becomes another plateau of performance. But it's very hard at this moment in time to quantify that impact of human and machine. So I always like to say, imagine if your organization was Radiohead and you came out with this incredible album. Many people would love that album. Right? Same thing.
Yeah.
So I think we need to really stand back and go, yes, we can replace some of these roles. And I don't think it's quite as easy as people make it out. And most people talking about these changes are people selling AI, let's be honest, right? Yeah, sure. So I think the bigger question for me is, what type of organizations are we trying to create that still gives us this level of competitive differentiation, but with this idea of human expansion between human and machine? That's the big one. And if we're serious about a society that we want to all live in with all the crap that we're dealing with, I think there are big questions. And somebody asked me about, gender balance and inclusion. They're absolutely really important, right? But actually the biggest inclusion challenge of our age is the inclusion of human beings in an autonomous age. That's the big one.
Yeah.
Everything else is like a lower level challenge, which are absolutely things that we need to solve. but they pale in comparison to this human, machine concept, right? And my worry is that the people who are selling this stuff are shouting the loudest, obviously highlighting all of the benefits, the efficiencies, the technological ideality. But as we all know, the benefits of these new technologies far outweigh the negatives at the start of their evolution. 2 or 3 years in, so take the combustion engine as an example, or I take social media as an example.
Yep.
As we use those technologies more and more, much bigger harms are created. So when people ask me, do you think AI will be a good thing or a bad thing? I say it will be both. So AI will have an equal and opposite impact on the negative side of things as much as it has on the positive side. And I think we have to recognize that and then design accordingly. So it's up to, you take our organisation, it's up to us to decide, are we stopping taking on graduates, Yep. But to me, that's a failure of imagination. I'd be asking the question, what if we had graduates using the best possible autonomous tools? What could we do? Right? What experiments could we run? What new innovations could we create? Forget about roles. What new skills could we develop? What new services could we develop for our clients? AI is not going to do that. It will help to deliver those services at speed, at zero cost, and all this kind of good stuff. But that's the magic for me, And I think, sorry for the long answer, but it's a big area, as you would imagine, at the moment. But I always come back to that point. I would prefer a Kid A album than an album from this band called Velvet Sundown, which in itself is such a bad name. Inside I die a little bit when I say the name, So.
Okay, so I'll follow up to that. If Future Work World was a song, what song would it be and why?
Oh, God. I'm going to say Radiohead, All You Can Leave Behind.
Okay.
Because if you do your musical research, a lot of people will say that is really the first meta-modern album, right? So the first album that plays to both human and machine, and plays it into a way that when you listen to it first, sounds totally different to anything you've heard before. But as you get used to it, it brings you to new places. And that's really what I would love our future work world to be ultimately.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have our soundbite from today's podcast episode. So the book introduces... I
was going to say, I did all of that talking and that's the only thing you're going to
The book introduces practical models developed by the Future Work Institutes. Why do you love working here? What's so special about the Institute?
I do come back to it's funny. I'm gonna go on another long-winded story. Sorry, Bill. I know you're slightly hungover from last night as well.
Certainly not, listeners.
You had the full Irish experience. I think it's safe to say last night. I was just surprised you didn't partake in some kind of a band, singing at some point. But anyway, I think. I'm going to talk about it as the example because it's always been the thing in my head that drives the Future Work Institute. So I don't know if you or your listeners know anything about haute couture, right? And I'm sure, we have all had those fathers that would point to these mad dresses and go, what the hell is that? Nobody's ever going to wear that thing. And it's really, haute couture really is this idea of innovation. It's to present new images to the world. So that then trickles down into other designers designing things that people will actually wear, more practical stuff.
Yeah.
But the whole couture part of things is really around challenging. It's around bringing new images to people. It's around bringing new stories to people that mightn't yet exist. And that's really what I love about what we do in the Future Work Institute, because I know you're big into your science fiction as well. And we've done a number of different projects. We call them immersive storytelling projects. But really what they are is they're presenting well-crafted potential futures of work for organizations that we work with. And then through that process, what they're actually doing is thinking about elements of that design and what it means to their world. So that's the haute couture connection, right? It's like haute couture to street fashion. And actually in the book, sorry, keep coming at the book. I'm trying to pitch the book, as you know, Bill. In the book, actually, there's actually...
You've got a new book out, Barry?
Yeah, I do, yes.
Oh,
yeah, it's called Future Work World. So I was going to read the inside flap there. So the big thing for me is there's actually 9 jumps into the future throughout the book.
Yep.
And they're designated by these black hole jumps, right? And that's really important to me because I think part of our role is to present these pictures. It doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, but they're presenting opportunities for innovation for organizations that they can adapt into their world. And that's what I love most about the kind of work that we do. And I always come back to that. It's really funny. I was a big fan of Alexander McQueen and John Galliano, these guys. for their artistry and their craft, you know. And that was right at the core of the idea behind the Future Work Institute, was to be this innovation playground, you know, challenging concept that sometimes people will go, that's a bit mad, uncomfortable when people say that. Because madness is what drives us on to something else. So that's really what really interests me about, you know, the work that we do here. Yeah.
So when you and I first spoke, which listeners, Barry and I already know each other a couple of weeks, but I love this guy.
That's true, actually. Yeah, it is weird actually, because it does feel as though we know each other longer. I don't know. Have you got some weird psychological trick happening, Jedi mind trick? But it seems to have kind of connected. Maybe we were Jedis in a previous life together. I don't know.
Well, in that first conversation, you mentioned that you've been doing some research around 100 tools of the future, you know, years in the future, what those tools look like that employees will be using.
Yeah,
that sort of stuff floats my boat. Can you tell the listeners a bit about that?
Yeah, actually, you know, and it's funny. So there's 9 jumps in the book, right? But the concept behind the broader idea is that there will be a website very soon, hopefully, that will almost be like a museum for the objects of the future of work. So ideally 100 over the next period of time. We've got about 40 developed. And they're all different aspects of those 3 W's, right? So one, for example, is immersive induction, right? Another one is this platform called Ludge, right? Another one is this model called disposable workers, right? So they're all fictional objects at 1, 3, and 10 years out that challenge people to think differently about what they do. And interesting enough, in the book, actually, even the jumps, I talk about using them as inspirations in your workshops or your meetings to think differently about the particular thing that you're working on. Yeah. So I love the idea of the weenie. I don't know if you know what a weenie is. What's in the book as well. It's a Disney developed concept. Okay. So basically any Disneyland castle is a weenie, right? And what a weenie is, it's something that draws your attention to it. It's there, no matter where you are in the park, you can still see this weenie and it will pull you towards it. There's like this natural pull towards a weenie. And, you know, one of the things that we're really interested in is using objects as narrative forms to challenge people around the design of what they do, right?
Yep.
And, you know, it's a broader design concept. You see it mostly used in theatrical and theme park design. But we would use it ourselves within the Future Work Institute to challenge a perspective, right? So it's so funny when you bring an object in, people critique the object, not the person who created the object. Right, and that's it. Just to put it, that's a very subtle difference, but you know what I'm talking about, and it enables proper debate and discussion around. Oh, actually, what if we did something like that in our organisation? It doesn't have to be all of that, because some of it's a bit out there, some of it's a bit mad. So, for example, one of my favourite ones, actually, I probably spent more time on it than a lot of parts in the book. I talk about there's a fictional review in the book. It's between 2 people. You know, you go for a yearly review, but it's called the Transformation Index.
Okay.
And there's 4 elements to the transformation index. And I won't say too much about it, but the whole idea is that you're measured based on your level of transformation of self, of the team, of your organization, of society. Right? Now that sounds like a massive stretch, but actually it's probably an opportunity for people to think differently about performance reviews, right? And that's what I mean about these weenie type ideas. They're challenging ideas to, you know, create different perspectives, different avenues on things. So hopefully that's good enough of an illustration. You'll have to buy the book to get more information on those particular objects.
Not me. I've got a copy that says my very, very best friend.
I know. I should have actually charged you for that one. That's the €100 version with the signature. You know. So hopefully all that makes sense, because sometimes I do say these things and people go, what the hell is he talking about? But I hope you get the concept. Coming from a sci-fi background, I'm sure you do. You know?
Barry, I've got some more questions for you. However, we have a strict format here.
Yes, I understand.
I've given you more than that terrible 5 minutes that you get for Disrupt Talk.
Well, actually, you know, can I just take up now? I had a minute and a half, I think. I did this to time myself, right? Okay. So now I've in a minute and a half. And now you've cut me to 20-something minutes, so I'm starting to feel a little bit put out.
We've done nearly 900 of these episodes on the HR Chat.
That's fair enough.
We know our sweet spot.
Yeah. In other words, you know, when people stop listening to the crazy person you're interviewing. Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah.
So with that said, I'm going to abandon the other questions that I wanted to ask you. Instead of turn it over to you, my question, I guess, before we wrap up is what else? What else would you like to share with our listeners today? And of course, as part of that, how can folks connect with you and get a copy of the book?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look, the big thing for me, right? And I know I don't want to come across as something trite, right? But we're definitely moving into I'm going to call it jumping the curve. We're moving into this new curve of work, right? So if I'm wearing my systems mindset, we're jumping into this new curve. And a lot of people, I know a lot of your viewers out there and listeners will, are sick to hearing about HR as being this, that, and the other. For me, the opportunity for HR is to strategically design future work worlds, right? But in order to do that, they're going to need to adopt a much broader mindset. They're going to have to apply thinking and tools that they're not comfortable with. And I think if they do that, they will be able to reimagine and imagine new avenues, new pathways, new competitive advantages for the people and for their organizations. That to me is the most important thing. And that's what the book ultimately tries to achieve. And 100%, anybody out there, you can see me on LinkedIn, Barry Winkless, you'll see me there. Website, barrywinkless.com. Future Work Institute, CPL, and Future Work World, the book. It's available everywhere globally. It's published by Wiley. So everything is in there. So I do think, though, the big thing for me is fundamentally there's an opportunity for HR to adopt this broader mindset and create really exciting future work worlds that work for all. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that just leaves me to say for this particular episode, I suspect I'll be getting you on again quite soon. But for this particular episode, Barry, thank you very much for being my guest.
Thanks very much, Bill.
And listeners, as always, until next time, happy working.
Thanks for listening to the HR Chat Show. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe and listen to some of the hundreds of episodes published by HR Gazette? And remember, for what's new in the world of work, subscribe to the show, follow us on social media, and visit hrgazette.com.